I never imagined I would find myself in such an odd and uncomfortable position, but here I was, standing in the living room with my husband Greg, watching the three young men he had invited over. My heart raced as confusion and unease washed over me, while Greg remained calm, almost too calm. He had planned this, though I hadn't realized it until it was already too late. The young men, barely out of their 20s, stood awkwardly by the door, uncertain about why they were there, though curiosity was evident in their eyes. Greg had always been the adventurous type, pushing limits. But this seemed like a step too far. Just trust me, Greg had whispered earlier when I expressed my discomfort with his latest idea. It'll be fine, you'll see. We'll just have some fun. Nothing serious, I promise. But now, standing there in my simple dress, the weight of his words felt much heavier, and the situation seemed far from lighthearted. Greg took a deep breath and gave me a reassuring smile, though it did nothing to ease the growing knot in my stomach. Everyone, this is my wife Claire, he said, introducing me as if we were simply hosting a casual dinner. At Claire, meet Jake, Eric, and Matt. I nodded politely, but I could barely suppress the tremor in my voice as I greeted them. Their youthful energy filled the room, and while they appeared polite enough, their presence only heightened my unease. Greg had assured me this was just an experiment, a fun game, but I wasn't sure what his true intentions were. We're all here to have a good time, Greg said, clapping his hands together. No pressure, no expectations. He glanced at me, his eyes silently asking for my agreement, pleading for me to go along with whatever was about to unfold. My throat tightened, but I trusted him, at least I wanted to. Jake, Eric, and Matt exchanged uneasy glances, clearly uncertain about what was happening. I couldn't help but wonder what Greg had told them. Did they know this was his idea? Did they think I was a willing participant in whatever bizarre fantasy he had dreamed up? Greg poured drinks and handed one to me, his hand brushing mine in what should have been a comforting gesture. Yet the excitement in his eyes only made me more anxious. This wasn't about me, I realized. It was about him and some strange need. He had to prove something, to push the boundaries of our relationship. The men sat down and Greg gestured for me to join them on the couch. I hesitated but sat at the far end, my mind racing as I tried to understand what was happening. They made small talk, asking about my life, my interests, and my marriage to Greg. I answered as politely as I could, but the tension in the room was thick, each glance and word carrying unspoken weight. As Greg leaned back with a satisfied smile, I realized this was just the beginning. The atmosphere grew more charged as the evening went on. Though no one overtly said anything, I could feel it. The unspoken pressure to play along with whatever Greg had planned. Jake, Eric, and Matt kept trying to engage me in conversation, but I could see the nervous looks they exchanged with Greg, as though they were waiting for him to give them some kind of signal. Greg sat back in his chair, swirling his drink, a look of quiet satisfaction on his face. Why don't we move outside, he suggested, gesturing toward the patio doors. It's a beautiful night, and I think we could all use some fresh air. My heart sank. I didn't want to go outside, where the dim lighting and secluded space would make everything feel even more intimate. But I felt cornered. There was an unspoken expectation for me to follow his lead. I glanced at him, hoping he would pick up on my discomfort. But Greg seemed unfazed, already standing. The three young men followed him out to the patio, and I trailed behind, feeling like I had no choice. The cool night air hit my skin as we stepped outside, the stars twinkling above us, a stark contrast to the heaviness weighing on my chest. Greg motioned for everyone to sit around the outdoor fire pit, and I reluctantly sat down, my eyes avoiding the others. The fire crackled in front of us as Greg began speaking about how much he valued trust in a relationship. Trust is everything, he said, glancing at me. And sometimes, in order to really trust someone, you have to push the boundaries a little. Step outside of your comfort zone. His words hung in the air, and I knew he wasn't just talking about the two of us anymore. The men seemed to sense the shift too. Jake, who had been the quietest of the three, cleared his throat and leaned forward. What exactly do you have in mind for tonight, Greg? He asked cautiously, his voice low. Greg smiled, his eyes fixed on me. I think Claire needs to open up a little more, he said casually, as if making an innocent observation. She's always been a bit reserved, a bit shy, and I thought tonight might be a good opportunity for her to let go, be free. My stomach twisted at his words. This wasn't what I had agreed to. I had signed up for something harmless, something playful. But now, sitting under the stars with three strangers watching me, I realized things were about to take a much darker turn. I felt exposed, vulnerable, as I could sense Greg's gaze on me, waiting for me to respond. Eric shifted uneasily, his eyes darting between Greg and me. I'm not sure this is something we should push, he began, but Greg quickly interrupted, still smiling. Relax, Greg said. This is all just for fun. CLA knows that, don't you, babe? His question lingered in the air, but I couldn't find the words to reply. My mind was racing, trying to understand how I had ended up in this situation. Was this really what Greg wanted? Did he want to see me act out some fantasy with these men, testing my loyalty, or perhaps just seeing how far he could push me? Jake, Eric, and Matt were clearly uncomfortable now, their attempts at small talk fading as the silence grew heavier. They had come here expecting a good time, probably thinking Greg was leading them into something thrilling. But now it seemed they were starting to realize the gravity of the situation. I swallowed hard and stood up, trying to break the tension. I think I need to step away for a moment, I said, my voice quivering slightly. I turned toward the door, hoping Greg wouldn't try to stop me. But just as I reached for the handle, I heard him speak again. CLA, he said softly, but his tone held an unmistakable authority. You're not going anywhere. I froze, my hand resting on the cool metal of the door handle. Greg's words hung heavily in the air, unyielding. My heart raced, and for a brief moment, I considered running, just opening the door and retreating into the house, away from the uncomfortable pressure surrounding me. But I stayed. I wasn't sure if it was out of fear of embarrassing Greg, or perhaps the silent plea I saw in his eyes when he spoke. Whatever it was, I slowly turned around and forced a smile, attempting to mask the turmoil swirling inside me. The three men glanced between Greg and me, their confusion and unease clear, but they remained seated, uncertain of what to do next. Claire, come sit back down, Greg said softly, his tone shifting from commanding to coaxing, as if trying to calm me. You're overthinking this. I hesitated for a moment, but eventually sat back down. My mind raced. What was he really trying to accomplish here? I wasn't naive. Greg had always liked pushing boundaries and challenging me. But this felt entirely different. The fire crackled in front of us, casting flickering shadows over the patio, adding to the already tense atmosphere. We've been married for, 10 years now? Greg said, addressing both me and the men. And over time, things can get predictable, you know what I mean? I just thought it might be good for Claire to try something new, something exciting. My pulse quickened at his words. What exactly did he expect me to do with these men? I could see the curiosity in their eyes, but they seemed just as unsure as I was. There was no denying that all three of them were attractive in their own way, Jake with his quiet intensity, Eric's easygoing charm, and Matt's boyish smile, but I didn't want this. Not like this. Jake was the first to speak again. Greg, maybe we're not all on the same page here, he said cautiously, glancing toward me. We don't want to make anyone uncomfortable. Eric nodded in agreement, sensing the tension. Yeah, man, this doesn't feel right if CLA isn't into it. I was grateful for their concern, but Greg remained unfazed. He leaned forward, locking eyes with me. Claire, I wouldn't have brought you into this if I didn't think you could handle it, he said gently. I know you better than anyone. I know you felt stuck, trapped in the same routine. This is your chance to break free, to explore something new. And it's all under your control. You decide how far you want to go. My breath hitched. The way he framed it sounded so simple, like he was offering me freedom, but it felt more like a test, a cruel one. He was putting me in a position where saying no would make me seem prudish or unwilling to explore, while saying yes would betray everything I had valued in our marriage. I turned to look at the men. They were waiting for my response, but I could see the discomfort on their faces. They hadn't signed up for this either, not like how Greg was presenting it now. But they were following his lead, unsure of what to do next. I don't know what you want from me, I whispered, my voice barely above a breath. I felt small, as if the weight of Greg's expectations was suffocating me. I loved him. I always had. But this situation was spiraling into something I hadn't prepared for. Greg's expression softened slightly, but there was still a determined glint in his eyes. I just want you to let go, Claire, he said. Stop holding back. You don't have to do anything you're not comfortable with, but I want you to trust me. Can you do that? The question felt like a trap. I wanted to trust him, but trust didn't mean blindly following him into situations that made me feel exposed and vulnerable. I glanced at the men again, who were now shifting uneasily in their seats, clearly uncertain about how to handle the tension. Jake leaned forward, breaking the silence. We can all just talk, right? No pressure. Let's just take it slow. His tone was calm, but I could tell he was trying to ease the tension. Greg smiled, obviously pleased. Exactly. Let's just talk. He leaned back, his eyes fixed on me, waiting for me to join in. But inside, I was starting to realize that this wasn't simply about talking, not for Greg. I sat there, feeling the weight of everyone's gaze. The crackling fire seemed to amplify the tension, as though the flames themselves were charged with the pressure I was feeling. Greg's words echoed in my mind. Just let go. But I couldn't. I wasn't ready for whatever he wanted this night to become. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't really about me. It never had been. Jake, Eric, and Matt exchanged awkward glances, clearly sensing my discomfort. They hadn't anticipated this, and it seemed like they were hoping for a way out just as much as I was. Jake cleared his throat, trying to break the heavy silence once again. Look, Claire, if you're not comfortable with this, we can just call it a night. No hard feelings. His words were a lifeline, and I longed to take it. But Greg's eyes were on me, his face calm but insistent, as if he was waiting for me to make a decision that would define our relationship from that point on. He had never pushed me this hard before, and now I felt like I was standing on the edge of something I didn't want to fall into. I think that's a good idea, I said at last, my voice trembling but firm enough to make my point. I'm not comfortable with this, Greg. I agreed to try something different, but this isn't what I expected. Greg's face hardened for a moment, disappointment flashing across his features. He took a deep breath as though trying to manage his emotions, then nodded slowly. I understand, he said, though his tone was cold. I just thought you'd be willing to step outside your comfort zone for once. I flinched at his words. He wasn't just disappointed, he was hurt. But I couldn't let that pressure me into going further. Greg, I've always trusted you, but this feels wrong. I can't just pretend I'm okay with it because you want me to. The three young men, sensing the situation was winding down, slowly stood up. Jake gave me a sympathetic look as he set his drink on the table. We didn't mean to cause any tension, he said softly, addressing me. I hope things work out between you two. Eric and Matt echoed similar sentiments, apologizing for the uncomfortable situation they had unknowingly walked into. They gathered their things, gave Greg polite nods, and headed for the door, eager to escape the awkwardness that had built up over the evening. As the door closed behind them, silence fell over the house. Greg stood by the fire pit, staring into the flames, his jaw clenched. I watched him for a moment, unsure of what to say. Part of me felt guilty for not going along with his plan, but a stronger part of me knew I had made the right choice. No matter how much I loved Greg, I couldn't let him push me into something that crossed my boundaries. Finally, Greg spoke, his voice quiet but laced with frustration. I thought you wanted more excitement. You've been telling me for months that things have felt stagnant, that you were bored with our routine. I tried to give you something different. I sighed, stepping closer to him, but keeping my distance. I do want excitement, Greg, but not like this. This doesn't feel like it's about us. It feels like it's about you testing me, seeing how far I would go, and that's not the kind of trust I want in our marriage. He didn't respond immediately, his eyes still fixed on the fire. I could see the gears turning in his mind, the frustration gradually giving way to understanding. He let out a long sigh, finally looking at me. Maybe I took things too far, he admitted, his voice softer now. I just wanted to shake things up. I didn't realize how much pressure I was putting on you. Relief washed over me as I heard those words. It's okay to want change, Greg, I said, my voice gentle. But we have to do it together, not like this, not with outside forces. We need to communicate better and figure out what we both want without crossing boundaries that make either of us uncomfortable. He nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing. You're right. I pushed too hard. I'm sorry, Claire. For the first time that evening, I felt a sense of peace. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. Greg and I still had a lot to talk about, a lot to work through, but at least we were back on the same page. As I reached out to take his hand, I knew this night would change things between us, but in the end, it might be for the better.